Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here at Villanova. This series on Catholic social teaching and race is really unique. It's a really incredible series. I hope you all are taking full advantage of it and putting the wisdom of all these scholars into action. So I want to thank Barbara Wall and thank Catherine and Marcella Bray for making this happen. I'm really happy to be with you this afternoon. It is a gorgeous day. Thank God for the beauty of this day and for this opportunity to converse together. So today I'm going to talk about a small piece of this book that I'm working on right now. And really simply put, I hope to articulate a contemplative practice or way of unlearning how white superiority deforms white people and the practice of the gospel. So I want to share a couple of stories to kind of provide some context to my own life and how I got into this work. I served as a lay pastoral associate at a really dynamic African-American Catholic parish in San Francisco called Sacred Heart. I was deeply blessed by the uncommon hospitality that our African-American brothers and sisters shared with my wife Kara and me when we first joined Sacred Heart in 1992. Our experience there drew us into the intimate community of faith that transformed our lives forever. Sacred Heart parishioners literally opened their arms and welcomed us as members of the parish on 3 successive Sundays, where we were in the midst of the congregation, and this entire congregation literally hugged us for 3 Sundays in a row and made us a part of their family. And they really taught us what it means to be a part of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So our own inherited bias began to wash away through the love of people who cared for us as their own. Their authentic witness to the gospel and the Sacred Heart of Jesus endures in my being. So my second story follows from that, and it's how our brothers and sisters at Sacred Heart really opened my wife Kara and I to really think about and pray about adopting cross-racially. And as we explored that in Chicago in the mid-1990s, I really felt the sting of the racism that people experience at Sacred Heart when going through the pre-adoption process. I went to a Catholic Charities program in Chicago, and the leader presented a hierarchy of preferred children based upon statistics of whom white parents chose to adopt. Healthy white babies were at the top. Eastern European, Asian, Central and Latin American backgrounds filled out the middle. At the bottom of preferred children were disabled babies of all races and black children. The leader presented the information without any historical or cultural context and without any reflection about how it related to, much less conflicted with, our Catholic faith and values. I left with a piercing sting of how this feels for African American brothers and sisters and a desire to be faithful to the love and care of our friends at Sacred Heart. So today I am still working through unearned white male privilege. And so I look forward to our conversation this afternoon. I have bifocals, so I'm gonna read a presentation, but I hope after at the conclusion that we can really have a great conversation. And you can follow. I provided an outline so you can follow the stream of my argument. So Catholic theology and social teaching celebrates God's invitation to embrace intimacy with the whole of creation. The last chapter of the book is going to take up the interconnection between ecological intimacy that Pope Francis calls for in Laudato Si and connecting that with Black Lives Matter. But I'm not going to get into that today. So in Vatican II, the Church's pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, opens with these enduring words. The joy and hope, the grief and anguish of men of our time, especially of those who are poor or afflicted in any way, are the joy and hope, the grief and anguish of the followers of Christ as well. The pastoral constitution continues to state, Christians cherish a feeling of deep solidarity with the human race and its history. This deep sense of solidarity with the whole of humanity calls the Church and people of God to read the signs of the times and interpret them in light of the gospel if it is to carry out its task. So our faith tradition is clear that people of faith are called to be in vulnerable communion with and for all people who are in any way oppressed, despised, or denigrated. As the moral theologian Brian Massengale framed it in his 2010 presidential address to the Catholic Theological Society of America, the acid test of authentic solidarity is whether and how it is practiced in the midst of social conflict. So the call to moral and spiritual intimacy is mystical and political. So what do we mean by that? I do not mean some kind of special knowledge, extraordinary vision, or Gnosticism. I'm drawing upon the contemplative Trappist monk Thomas Merton as a helpful guide to understand how and why the mystical and political are intimately interwoven with one another. I'm particularly drawing upon his book, Seeds of Destruction, which is his path-breaking work addressing white complicity. It came out in 1964. And if you haven't read it, I would invite you to read it alongside his book, New Seeds of Contemplation. Merton begins by noting that the contemplative life is not an abstraction, and it's not a flight from the world. The contemplative life is not and cannot be, Merton states, a mere withdrawal, a pure negation, a turning of one's back on the world and its suffering, its crises, its confusions and errors. Monastic communities are fully implicated in the sinfulness of the world, he explains, and must witness to baptismal conversion into God's love in the midst of worldly injustice. To forget or ignore one's implication in the sin of the world, continues Merton, does not absolve the monk or any contemplative from responsibility in events which his very silence and not knowing may constitute a form of complicity. Practicing silence does not disconnect one from time and space. On the contrary, silence connects us with the whole of reality, including this time and space in which we live. At the very outset of Seeds of Destruction, Merton recalls 20th century history, when monastic communities remained silent in Europe in the first half of the 20th century. Merton notices that too often they were giving support to totalitarian regimes. Otherworldly silence and renunciation itself becomes complicit in the evil of the world. And this connects to today, when a therapeutic spirituality sells, when spirituality tends to be overly concerned with making individuals feel better about themselves and comfortable with the status quo. His warning endures. This is especially true when whites tend to be more concerned with personal wholeness while we remain ignorant or complacent about racial violence. On the other hand, Merton does not join any partisan political cause. He does not want a monastic movement in politics. However, Christianity and contemplatives cannot reject history. Christianity is centered upon a historical event that changes the entire meaning of time and history. This means that the freedom of the Christian contemplative is not freedom from time, rather it is freedom in time. And so Merton wrote, "It is the freedom to go out and meet God in the inscrutable mystery of his will here and now, in this precise moment in which he asks man's cooperation in shaping the course of history according to the demands of divine truth, mercy, and fidelity." He argues that the solemn obligation of conscience is now ours as a nation that is retreating from its democratic and faith commitment to live up to its creed that all people are created equal. If he is to live up to his vow of poverty, Merton reflected in 1964, "It seems illusory if I do not in some way identify myself with the cause of people who are denied their rights and forced, for the most part, to live in abject poverty. To have a vow of obedience seems to me absurd if it does not imply a deep concern for the most fundamental of all expressions in God's will, the love of his truth and of our neighbor. Practicing racial intimacy is mystical and political precisely because of the unity of love of God and love of neighbor. It is political because we have yet to create the conditions of the possibility for full human thriving for black and brown peoples." So in the wake of the brutal murder of 9 members of the Emmanuel African Methodist Church in Charleston, South Carolina, do we perceive the intimate connections between care for the whole of creation and black lives? Our African American brothers and sisters can't breathe. Remember Eric Gardner. Can't eat Skittles or wear a hoodie. Trayvon Martin. Can't play loud music. Jordan Davis. Can't play as a child in a park. Tamir Rice. Can't seek help after an accident. Renisha McBride. Can't walk to a store with a friend. Rakia Boyd. Can't move to a new city and a new job. Sandra Bland. And can't pray in their own church. Cynthia Hurd, the Reverend Clementa Pickney, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Tywanza Sanders, Ethel Lee Lance, Susie Jackson, the Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor, the Reverend Daniel Lee Simmons, and Myra Thompson. In this context, the poet Claudia Rankine shares how a black mother told her, "The condition of black life is one of mourning." If predominantly white churches value black lives, indeed all lives, and then they will then be intimately involved with that mourning and working to end the conditions that create such mourning. two things about the witness of the 9 AME church members haunt theologian Willie James Jennings. First, Jennings is haunted by the fact that Dylan Roof was present in the intimate space of that Bible study, sitting there at a table with these saints of God who are seeking to hear a holy word just for them, just for this moment. I would feel less pain if he simply walked into the church and started shooting. Then I could live with the fact that this young man did not give God's voice the chance to penetrate his contorted heart. The pain is that Roof did hear the sound of grace and communion. God's voice was sounding in Emmanuel. He simply resisted it. Second, Jennings is haunted by the forgiveness that the families of victims offered Roof. He calls us to remember the words of Reverend Daniel Lee Simmons' granddaughter, who said, "We are here to combat hate-filled actions with love-filled actions." Jennings struggles to understand how black folks are called upon throughout the centuries, and I quote, "in torturous repetition to forgive those who kill us, and we do it. The only way I can fathom this grace of forgiveness is if the very life of God flows through people like these black families." Yet Jennings also struggles with how forgiveness is interpreted. Too often it is used to avoid dealing with whiteness and the state of war it creates in America. Forgiveness can become a soothing high that does not address the lie that is white supremacy. I believe that white people ought to be haunted too. We ought to be haunted by the connection we have with white people who foment racial terror. Consider the odd conversation that recently ensued in the wake of the August Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, which was organized to protect a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee and resulted in the murder of Heather Heyer. The President of the United States says that there were people on many sides who committed violence. He asked, and I quote, "George Washington was a slave owner. How about Thomas Jefferson? Because he was a major slave owner. Now are we going to take down his statue?" Too many commentators, including U.S. Catholic bishops, in their condemnation, I believe, missed a deeper reality and opportunity. As they have done in the past, some bishops condemned racism and white supremacy, but provided little description of what those terms mean. That leaves white Catholics with the prevalent and erroneous assumption that racism is only about individuals who overtly convey negative attitudes against people of another race. Condemnation completely fails to address how good white people of faith continue to be complicit in reproducing white supremacy. The gaping wound that is racism has only festered to a point that is humanly unbearable. Nevertheless, many white people live in a way that renders it impossible for whites to hear, to see, to feel, or comprehend this reality. Too many white faith communities remain distant from and immune to cries for justice from African American, Latinx, and First American communities. That the U.S. bishops and pastoral leaders hesitate to claim that Black Lives Matter only underscores the church's estrangement from black and brown people and its witness to Eucharistic intimacy. The church's complicity in white supremacy puts it in a profound theological, moral, and pastoral bind. If the church maintains its silence to its enduring complicity, it denies God's grace, hope, and healing in the Eucharistic memory of Jesus Christ. Through continued silence, the church risks, as theologian M. Sean Copeland warns, the the blasphemy of continued contempt for black creatures who share the glory, beauty, and image of the divine. On the other hand, practicing racial intimacy means taking risks that will alienate privileged people comfortable with the status quo. So I now turn to more in-depth working with Merton's Seeds of Destruction. In that book, Merton identified 3 seeds of destruction. First, the illusion of white superiority and innocence. Second, the illusion of self-sufficiency in prioritizing profits over people. And third, white fears and projection, which ultimately result in a false sense of reality, a false sense of self, of ourselves and others, and a false faith. All of these alienate us and destroy society, wound the mystical body of Christ, and tear all of us apart from God and neighbor. As long as white society remains attached to the status quo and views itself as the only acceptable reality, Merton finds, then the problem remains without solution and there will inevitably be violence. Recall how Merton drew upon James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. For Baldwin, white innocence constitutes the crime. It is how whites tend to think, speak, and act as if we play no role in the racial conflict that is largely of our making. The story of innocence that we tell ourselves renders the most basic questioning of white privilege and systemic racism invisible for critical reflection. It is not only that whites tend to live by the myth of American innocence, but that we also live by a fantasy of Christian innocence. Even as we may affirm universal human dignity, white racial bias is shaped by Christian imagery of good and evil, in which white equals innocent and black equals guilty. In the core argument of our book, The Scandal of White Complicity in U.S. Hyper-Incarceration, my co-authors and I argue is the implicit theology and spiritual practice of black guilt and white innocence. The American rhetoric of innocence is associated with white. This assumption implicitly invokes that which is guilty is black. This practice subverts any claim that all human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. The assumption of white racial innocence also means that white people who claim to follow the nonviolent Jesus, who claim to be committed to peace through justice, including whites who claim the mantle of nonviolent contemplatives like Merton, can do so without ever addressing the violence that people of color confront every day. Merton indicts white American Catholicism. He says, to assume the superiority of the white race and of European American culture as axiomatic, and to proceed from there to integrate all other races and cultures by a purely one-sided operation is a pure travesty of Catholic unity in truth. Naming this fake Catholicism, Merton contends that we live by a parody of unity that is no unity at all, but a one-sided attempt to reduce others to a condition of identity with ourselves is one of the most disastrous misconceptions. Like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s analysis of the triple evils of racism, militarism, and consumerism, so Merton sees white racism as intimately intertwined with militarism and the American propensity to put profits over people. White prosperity is rooted in racial injustice and sin. The real tragedy, Merton writes, is that the white man who does not realize that though he seems to himself to be free, he is actually the victim of the same servitudes which he has imposed on the Negro. passive subjection to a lotus-eating commercial society that he has tried to create for himself, and which is shot through with falsity and on freedom from top to bottom. Merton believes that this reality gives rise to a tougher Negro leadership, to use his language, no longer moderate and nonviolent, and much more likely to utilize the threat of force represented in the critical mass of frustrated, angry, and jobless African Americans in cities across the nation. Sporadic violence ought to be expected, Merton suggests, even if it is labeled as delinquency rather than overt revolution. So recall that, like Martin Luther King, Merton acknowledges that delinquency is an expression of deeper suffering and injustice itself. A more violent situation was being fomented by a deadly combination of three forces. First, overt white Southern racists became entrenched in their refusals against universal dignity and rights. Southern white society feels itself faced with destruction. Southern society, says Merton, is menaced in its being, even if its self-image and view of reality is false. We know from experience with other notorious forms of fanaticism, Merton reflects, that societies that experience their reality on this psychopathic level are precisely those whose members are most convinced of their own rightness, their own integrity, indeed their own complete infallibility. It is this experience of unreality as real and as something to be defended against objective facts and rights, as though against the devil himself, that produces the inferno of racism and conflict. Second, African Americans rightfully became more determined to assert their own power, including the use of force if necessary. Merton recognized that as violence was used against African Americans organizing for the right to vote, and that because the vote would take time to create change, that such violence only encourages African Americans to prefer bullets to ballots. Third, and perhaps the most violent component of the mix of destructive seeds, stood white liberals. Good intentions are not enough. As African Americans and other people of color have expressed for centuries, good intentions may only hide a more subtle form of white superiority. A false sense of reality, as well as religious faith, plants seeds of destruction deep in the soil of American churches and society. Today, Merton's insight into this cauldron of violence seems prescient. And I quote, "Where minds are full of hatred and where imaginations dwell on cruelty, torment, punishment, revenge, and death, then inevitably there will be violence and death." So now I'm turning to the section that's violent, that is entitled Racism Without Racists, or Elegant Racism. Recall that the same year that Merton wrote his letters to a white liberal, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom created one of the most successful mass mobilizations in U.S. history, drawing over 250,000 participants. A. Philip Randolph, who had been advocating for civil and economic rights since 1917, first started the March on Washington movement in 1941. While we celebrate equal access to public accommodations, interracial marriage and families, laws against racial discrimination in employment, and black voting rights attained through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, although these are under assault today, the key economic, housing, and education goals of the 1963 March on Washington remain unrealized. A recent Pew Research Center study finds that the current wealth gap between whites and blacks has reached its highest point since 1989, when whites had 17 times the wealth of black households. Likewise, the wealth of white households is more than 10 times the wealth of Hispanic households, compared with 9 times in 2010. And although the U.S. Supreme Court decided that school segregation was unconstitutional and inherently unequal in 1954, a recent national study finds that, and I quote, nationwide, the typical black student is now in a school where almost 2 out of every 3 classmates are low income, nearly double the levels of the schools of typical white or Asian student. ProPublica found that in 1972, due to strong federal enforcement, only about 25% of black students in the South attended intensely segregated schools in which 9 out of 10 students were racial minorities. However, in districts released from federal court orders between 1990 and 2011, 53% of black students attend such schools. These numbers need to be understood in a context in which white Americans tend to self-segregate more than any other group. The Public Religion Research Institute's 2013 American Values Survey reveals that 75% of white Americans have fully white social networks with no people of color. As Merton recognized, integration is always going to be not on our street, but somewhere else. The March on Washington also demanded a national minimum wage of $2 per hour, which is $13 per hour in today's dollars. After adjusting for inflation, the minimum wage today of $7.25 is worth $2 less than in 1968, when Dr. King was advocating for the sanitation workers in Memphis. Since Dr. King was assassinated, the income gap between blacks and whites has narrowed by just 3 cents on the dollar. At this rate of progress, income inequality will not be achieved for 537 years. These inequalities are compounded by a system of mass incarceration. Michelle Alexander calls America's incarceration regime the new Jim Crow, because we have not ended racial class in America, we have merely redesigned it. We incarcerate African Americans at a rate higher than South African apartheid. The United States, with less than 6% of global population, accounts for 25% of all people incarcerated in the world. Between 1980 and 2000, the number of people incarcerated increased from roughly 300,000 to over 2 million. There are now over 7 million people in the criminal justice system. And that means at every point of the system. And consider police violence. About twice a week or every 3 or 4 days, an African American has been killed by a white police officer, explains Isabel Wilkerson, citing FBI data. The banality of this reality, as she observes, obscures the fact that this is nearly the same rate at which African Americans were lynched in the early 20th century. In her call to Americans to own up to our own violence, Wilkerson details the uncanny similarities between lynchings and the police shooting of Michael Brown, not the least significant of which is the fact that the lynched body was sometimes left hanging for days or weeks as a lesson for people to not step outside the caste into which they had been born. Michael Brown's body was left in the street for over 4 hours, where his mother and relatives were not allowed to be near his body. we must ask. So through 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow segregation and lynching, 65 years of separate but equal housing and education policy, and over 30 years of disproportionate arrests, sentencing, prosecution, and incarceration of people of color, can we claim that we are a free and equal society? Despite these glaring racial disparities, we now live in the absurdity of racism without racists. The sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva utilizes this term, racism without racists, to describe a society that reduces racism to overt acts of individual malice, as it ignores how we systemically reproduce white dominance. The way we culturally value whiteness and criminalize blackness belies any notion that we live in a so-called post-racial world. As Merton recognized, the problem is deeper. Not only are white Americans unable to see our own bias, we also tend to live by the myth that we are racially innocent. Lori Cassidy, Margaret File, and I entitled our book, The Scandal of White Complicity, precisely for this reason. Extending Merton's point theologically, all people are good by the fact of being made in the image of God. Every person is a gift of God's creation. Inherent in that gift is moral responsibility. It is for this theological and practical reason that people who may be otherwise morally upright may miss how racism addresses us. The journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates contends that while we focus on overt acts of individual malice, racism, elegant, lovely, monstrous, carries on. Coates describes a brand of systemic racism more sophisticated than that demonstrated by overt racists. He notices how elegant racism is invisible, supple, enduring. It disguises itself in the national vocabulary, avoids epithets and didacticism. Grace is the singular marker of elegant racism. The grace of this racism is how it employs lobbyists dressed in the finest suits, lives in neighborhoods with manicured lawns, and includes the most active citizens who vote for judges, legislators, district attorneys, and policies that maintain white innocence as we criminalize blacks and blackness. The attractive goods of school and neighborhood choice often hide very subtly the ways white Americans withdraw funding and resources from cities and communities of color for schools, housing, healthcare, transportation, and jobs. Elegant racism does not require that a realtor tell a black person that they cannot buy a specific property, nor does it require that white people consciously seek out a white realtor to help them find a neighborhood in a predominantly white neighborhood. The discriminatory operations of law, economy, and real estate render such explicit, overtly racist personal interaction unnecessary. The law places the onus on proving intentional racist intent to exclude a person from renting or buying a property, a legal measure that is extremely difficult to prove. People need not state that location, location, location is white location, white location, white location. This supple evasion ignores the linkage between home ownership and the relative valuing of whiteness over blackness when whites own a home earlier in life and gain more home equity over a lifetime than do people of color. Sophisticated racism ignores how African American and Latino borrowers are more likely to receive subprime loans than white borrowers, even when studies are controlled for legitimate risk factors. Predatory payday lenders, without any hint of racism, frequently locate their shops in the most economically vulnerable communities of color. And so I wonder, with W.E.B. Du Bois and Ta-Nehisi Coates, when and how will white Americans deny the God of white supremacy? It is a question that goes to the very heart of faith and the baptismal vows of Catholics to reject Satan and worship one God. So I come to my conclusion. Merton invites us to contemplatively confront our complicity in racial violence in America and embrace the mystical body of Christ. If white people of faith desire racial equity, justice, and intimacy, I believe with Merton that that means taking up an ascetic discipline of dying to self as a starting point of resistance to racism. As moral theologian Brian Massengale puts it, and I quote, "Racial solidarity is a paschal experience, one that entails dying of a false sense of self and renunciation of racial privilege so as to rise to a new identity and status that is God-given." In Merton's view, if white people were truly to internalize the courageous witness of the civil rights movement, they would cease to be the people they were. They would have to die to everything that was familiar and secure. They would have to die to their past, to their society with its prejudices and inertia, die to false beliefs. In Merton's estimation, a genuine white response to African Americans' thirst for love and justice must consist of two things. The first is a complete reform of the social system which permits and breeds such injustice. And second, Merton writes, this work of reorganization must be carried out under the inspiration of the Negro whose providential time has now arrived and who received from God enough light, ardor, and strength to free the white man in freeing himself from the white man. Goodwill and charity are insufficient. Merton does not question white sincerity. Rather, creating social, political, and economic structures that are just is constitutive of being transformed into God's intimate love for the world. Even work for justice is insufficient without a profound turning to African Americans in their experience, wisdom, and truth. Merton calls whites to practice Christ's kingdom of humility by turning our full attention to people in the fullness of their humanity, as they are, not as whites imagine, fear, wish, or project them to be. Merton illuminates how humility frees one to renounce the protection of violence and risk being humble, therefore vulnerable, not because he trusts in the supposed efficacy of a gentle and persuasive tactic that will disarm hatred and tame cruelty, but because he believes that the hidden power of the gospel is demanding to be manifested in and through his poor person. The practice of humility joins obedience to God with the great commandments to join love of God and love of neighbor. The purpose of humility is not simply to edify or to develop my own relationship with God. Rather, humility opens us to the alternatives offered by the Spirit and the basilia of God. Humility opens the possibility whereby we may bear suffering with our brothers and sisters in Christ. Hence, Merton writes, in perfect obedience to the gospel, he effaces himself and his own interests and even risks his life in order to testify not simply to the truth in a sweeping, idealistic, and purely Platonic sense, but to the truth that is incarnate in a concrete human situation involving living persons whose rights are denied or whose lives are threatened. Practicing Christ's humility means that whites must learn from African Americans about the ways that we whites are imprisoned both to a false idealization of ourselves as racially innocent and to a false demonization of African Americans. Merton invites white Americans to see ourselves as African Americans have seen and experienced us through history. When whites see ourselves as African Americans do, then we may see where Jesus stands. Jesus, as the one who bears the violent wrath of dominant society, stands with the demonized as a way of calling us to transformation through lived solidarity and intimacy. Merton specifically invites white Americans to listen to the freedom and gospel songs, to carefully read and integrate into their lives King's letter from Birmingham jail and James Baldwin's prophetic books, among many other sources. Turning to African Americans means breaking down white boundaries and embracing our shared humanity. It means attending to the experiences and wisdom of our Muslim brothers and sisters, including Malcolm X. This also means listening to contemporary perspectives, such as in hip hop, as my colleague Lori Cassidy expresses in our book, The Scandal of White Complicity. Ultimately, Christ's love invites humility before all others who have given us life and who reveal God's infinite love for the world. The wound that is racism in America afflicts all of us. A contemplative, prophetic practice is intimately present in vulnerable communion with people suffering that wound. It shares in their mourning and yearning for love and justice. May we join together on this path, including here at Villanova, so that we might yet realize the African American wisdom that God makes a way where there is no way. Then we may truly practice racial intimacy. Then we may yet walk the way of the light of love of neighbor, where we enter into Christ, our shared light and love, and walk the only way of hope for liberation and salvation. Amen. So take a moment, stretch if you need to stretch, or take a break. Come on back. I know it's a lot, but I would love to hear your comments, questions, suggestions. Jerry.
Thank you, Alex. That was fantastic. As you said, a lot to think about and contemplate.
Yes.
I'm really struck by and appreciate your returning to Merton and offering us his wisdom and his indictment of us, essentially, and of our complicity in white supremacy. And I'm struggling to think about how to formulate this, but thinking about his time and our time, and I know no other way of saying this, but the horrifying politics that we witness and that we participate in, this country today. And how would Merton address those political dynamics, those political dimensions, the political structures?
Yeah.
Does he offer us anything,
Yes.
or do we need to go beyond Merton to address them?
Yeah. Well, first off, as I was introducing his thought, I mean, I think that he had insight into the seeds of violence that we're contending with today. And that I do believe that he put his finger on a dynamic that didn't start. It didn't start last year with last year's election. It didn't start. It didn't start with electing President Barack Obama in 2008. It's much deeper and much further than that. Okay, and so I think that gosh, I mean, there's so many dynamics right now that I think that he really has profound insight into, and I think how we can take that up, number one, is that we have yet to really contend with the history of slavery and with the history of the implications of slavery. I don't know if you all have seen, but there are a number of books that have come out in the past decade about slavery. There's one most recently. It's entitled "The Half Has Never Been Told." The half has not been told, and it's a quote from an African American who was a slave, and who was interviewed, during the Great Depression by the Works Progress Administration. They did this huge interview process with slaves, and The Half Has Never Been Told really delves into that experience from African American perspective, and looks into the fact that, our history, as the comedian Trevor Noah has a great book that's entitled "Born a Crime," because he was born to a white dad, African American mom. Literally a crime in South Africa. And in his book, he talks about he's blown away by the way Americans deal with the history of slavery. And the way he puts it is, okay, the American approach to this history is there was slavery. And here we are today. It doesn't contend with the brutality of slavery, the violence. In this book, The Half Has Never Been Told gets into how modernity and capitalism is based in slavery. We would not be the nation that we are without slave labor. And we haven't taken that up. We haven't taken up the violence inherent in that practice, and we haven't taken up also remembering. Like Sean Copeland talks about the importance of remembering as a work of the Eucharist, and that's key for Merton also. So I think that is a work that has to be done to be able to kind of step back and see how we got to where we are today. And there's a lot more to say, but that's a start. Barbara.
Alex, thank you. I mean, it was really remarkable. Um, just a few things. One is...
Thank you. Take care.
I'm not sure most of the people here know who Thomas Merton is. And some of us
Yeah.
older people do. That's one thing. But the second
Yeah, I
thing
can
is
talk
that
about
the same way, well, in the late 15th century, early 16th century, the arguments that went on in Spain, particularly among the theologians, about the nature of the African
Yes,
slave
yes.
and the American Indian. And the argument was whether or not the African and the American Indian was truly human. And the argument that won out was very Aristotelian in nature, that the African and the American Indian was not fully human because some people, this is the issue of natural dominance, some people are born to be dominated, some individuals, whether human or not, I guess, are born to be dominated by others. That won out over Juan de las Casas' argument about the inherent dignity of the African and later also of the Indian as human beings, of the Indian first and later of the African American. And there's a group of Catherine Drexel, maybe those of you from
Yes.
Philadelphia have heard of her. She was a woman who stood out as someone from a wealthy family but started a community of women specifically to teach African American children and American Indians. So she started schools on Indian reservations, etc., that still continue. But the point being, we have a history theologically of seeing people as less than human. In addition to that, the American Constitution saw
Yes.
African American slaves and American Indians as less, well, they saw them as 3/5 of a person for representation,
Right.
right? So we have a strong history of seeing people of
Right.
color as less than myself,
Yes.
theologically and historically. So
Yes.
it's difficult because it's part of, we have to own that history.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's part of the remembrance to be sure that somehow it doesn't happen again. So that sense of inherent dignity of the human being we haven't, and I agree with you that the bishops have been more silent than ever on a lot of what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, so it's also really critical to understand what Barbara's saying and how that relates to the history of colonialism, and also how we seem to think as if that history of colonialism has nothing to do with us, but it has everything to do with us. Okay, as Barbara was saying, I mean, first off, there's a theological argument that was put into practice in colonialization, and that includes in the United States, and that's why we have how many First Peoples, First Nations reservations are there in the United States? Why is it that when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, all of a sudden people are wondering, well, Puerto Rico, what is that? How does it relate to us? It's a U.S. territory. The Black Catholic Theological Symposium is meeting on one of the U.S. Virgin Islands. And also the same conversation as with Puerto Rico, all of a sudden we have a president who doesn't even know what the relationship is. And I think that reflects not only his ignorance, but ignorance of a whole nation. Okay? And I've written in the past also about how that has become we have internal borders of whiteness that we impose throughout our society. Okay, so that we have really, they're deep historical, theological, moral roots that we have to contend with. Please.
Alex, thank you very much for this talk. You've given us a lot to think about. You mentioned the disparity, the 17-fold disparity between the net worth of white Americans and net worth of African Americans and others. And it made me remember something that when I first realized it struck me very, very strongly. After the war, after the Second World War, there were a number of housing developments built on Long Island and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and some even in Puerto Rico, as a matter of fact, called Levittown.
Yes.
And Levittown was a development of small, some would say cookie cutter homes. I thought they were adorable, that were meant to make housing affordable for GIs coming home from the war. So after this horrendous experience that these fellows had, mostly men, some women as well, but everybody suffered. They had this castle, this little place that they could come home to and call their own. And I thought that was fabulous. Until I learned, I still think it's fabulous up to a point, until I learned that no black people were allowed to live there. So while the white GIs came home and started to build equity in their homes, black people were warehoused in high-rises that they could only rent. So I often thought to myself, well, why do we have this terrible disparity between white households and black households as far as their net worth is concerned? And there was the concrete example, that development, that Levittown development that I thought, and still do, see as a boon to the men and women who came home from the war, only to the white men and women who came home from the war.
Yes.
So there's the clearest possible example in the last 70 years of why white households have money and black households don't, because there's no equity built up.
Right. Well, and yeah, like my father benefited from, when he returned from service in World War II, he received the GI Bill, and with the GI Bill, he went to graduate school, got a degree that led to well-paying job that I benefit from, okay? And in the African American parishes that Kara and I have lived in, we've heard stories of African Americans who served as nobly as my father, who did not get the GI Bill. They didn't get those benefits, and were not able to utilize that seed money for whatever to build wealth. We also need to look at how the whole design of Roosevelt's, with the beginning of Social Security, federal housing, everything was designed so that Southern Democrats would vote for that package. So that meant cutting out African Americans from all of those benefits that have been critical ever since then. So there's a great new book out for anyone who's interested in that area. There's a new book out by Richard Rothstein. It's entitled The Color of Law. And he gets into depth about how government policy worked with private insurance and other concerns to create the situation that we're in today. It's a great book, The Color of Law. In the back, please.
Thank you, Alex. That was very interesting. When you use the phrase people of color in the book, are you specifically referencing African Americans and sometimes Hispanics, like the way that you use it in this talk?
Yeah. Our language is horrible, and I don't have a solution for that. I think I don't like the term people of color. It's not right. doesn't feel right to me. I mentioned, okay. In this book, I am dealing with a part of a larger problem that Patricia Hill Collins calls the matrix of domination. And the matrix of domination is about the intersection of how race, gender, class, all of these come together. And it's incredibly, I'm certainly coming up against the limits of our language in getting this right. But what I want to say is that my work is, I'm specifically focused on whites and African Americans, but I'm trying to put it in a larger context because it's interrelated with that whole larger context. And that's why I mentioned, for example, I use the term Latinx, which is a new term that's trying to acknowledge the diversity within Latina, Latino, Hispanic. There's the diversity within the histories of Spanish-speaking peoples is incredible, and you can't encapsulate it in a word or words. So that's a great question. It's an issue I'm grappling with. Don't have an easy answer for you. Yes.
I would like to suggest a book.
Okay.
It's called The Warmth of Other Sun.
Yes, Isabel Wilkerson. Yes.
And it's not a new book. It's been out
A few years.
Yeah, some years.
Yeah.
But it does explain the black migration
Yes.
to the north, to the Midwest, and to the west.
Yes.
And what you're right on, and how you approached the socioeconomic aspect of your talk. So that book was
Yes.
very, brought your talk brought memories back.
Yes.
Remain in the book. And I can also say I experienced what you brought in your talk. Yeah, that's my comment.
Okay.
Another form or another place that I'd like to go to is to state how much of a risk it is to go against the system.
Yes.
When Dr. King did it, he was branded many names.
Yes. Yes.
And I remember he referred to, being silent or doing nothing is the greatest sin of all. And I'm comparing that to what's happening in the NFL. It's interpreted by some to be a desecration to the flag.
Yes. Yeah.
The underlying meaning is not everyone is free under that flag. When we say our Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all, it's not happening.
Right.
And there are, I don't know what the term you use, I forget it, but it's as if people had that belief, I don't know if you called it racism without racists, I'm not sure. But it's those people who feel that the act that's happening within the NFL
Yes.
is very undermining our nation. But what those players are doing is trying to get a social venue to call on a social issue. And it's misinterpreted even as high up as our own president.
Yeah, and I think you're right on. I think it would be on the issue that you're raising about the NFL players, I think it would be great to read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail in that context, because that's exactly what he's saying to the 8 white clergy in Alabama. He's saying, because the 8 white clergy, remember, were saying, wait till another time. You know, work through the system. Dialogue with us. Okay, and Dr. King, and that's where, you know, the practice of nonviolent witness was so critical. You know, I'm dating myself now, but I remember when I was a young boy at the time, but I remember my family did not like Martin Luther King. My immediate family and our extended family, Martin Luther King was anathema to the country. And we have forgotten that. And we've put him up on a pedestal, and so we've put him in a safe place where we really don't take up what he's saying. I think you're right on. Please.
Thinking about the idea of slavery and what became of it, my recollection is that there was kind of a light switch quality to it. In 1863, the switch was thrown. It's illegal. It's been
Emancipation Proclamation.
It's been removed.
Okay.
So now there isn't any more slavery. So what's your problem? And the fact of the matter is, of course, it went on and on and on.
Well, and also I think, and that's another thing that I think is critical about our history, is, and Ta-Nehisi Coates gets into this in his latest book that's entitled, "We Were 8 Years in Power." And he's not referring to Barack Obama, although the book is about Barack Obama. It's about 8 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Do you all know what African Americans did after the Emancipation Proclamation? Do we know that history, folks? Do we know how African Americans rose up, got into positions of power in state legislatures throughout the South, and took the reins of power and tried to change the system through the system itself? And within 10 years, there was white backlash. There was white rage.
Just like today.
Just like today. Maybe we don't have the overt forms of whites only, and maybe we don't have the sickening, grotesque lynching, but we do have practices that are no less violent. We need to take that up, and we need to. Part of what I'm talking about in this book is, it's not that, I'm not saying that, and people who are working in racial equity practice, we're not saying that African Americans are victims only. Not at all. On the contrary, in the midst of slavery, they have been full of agency, and our democracy and Christian faith has been transformed by the wisdom of many diverse African peoples. We have yet to take up that history and how it can inform who we can become. Yeah.
One second short point. What we're experiencing today politically is something that has to happen. We have to know that these attitudes, these points of view, these mindsets are out there and are active. have to know that.
Well, I think that what I'm trying to say is it's in us.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that is why we need to, and that's what I was introducing. I just began to tell the story, but Kara and we took up anti-racism training as a way of life, as a way to prepare how to raise African American children. And we've been doing it ever since. And it's continuing work. It's ongoing. It has to become a way of life. And I think, and that's what I'm trying to invite with this book and this argument.
In the beginning kind of intro, I heard that you're an activist, and I was just wondering about the tangible ways that you do anti-racist, like kind of deconstruction. I don't know what the right word is.
Yes. Great question. That can be a whole other presentation, but briefly, it includes a number of practices. So I do with Asian Americans, Latina, and African American brothers and sisters. I co-lead anti-racism training. It's also in how I do legislative advocacy. So in Louisiana, I've done legislative advocacy on the death penalty and also on predatory payday lending. And so when we do that, the way that we do that, it's critical to follow the lead of communities of color. And instead of having white people be in control. Okay, so that means when we have a racial justice community organizing meeting, the meeting is structured in a way that actually begins in New Orleans. It begins with a huge meal with the best New Orleanian food, and which is Eucharist. It's practice of Eucharist, but it's led by African American men and women, and so it's with the practice itself. It's an attempt to change the structures in how we relate and how we do live and work together. That's just beginning to answer your question. It's not everything. Thank you. Others? Thank you, everyone.